Alright everyone, we are here today with Rillian and Amara doing Guilebot practice and tying it into what else we've done for the day. We're looking into the style and the way you can use Guilebot in particular to work on your own style, given that Guilebot's style is minimal at best, given that he's Guile. Now, if you're not familiar with the character too much and haven't been terribly beaten up online, Guile is defensive. He uses basically 2 special moves and uses a lot of down back motions, charges to set up his stuff. As always, this content is being rebroadcast from Amara2MK channel to MK main channel itself with our full permission. So the Guilebot is fairly simple. I'm not going to go into the inputs for now. That will come later on in this stream. What we're looking at is what bulldogging is, how to use it, and how to use signature actions of your own to get where you want to go against the really defensive character. What therefore I will go into first is the point system, which you'll be seeing demonstrated as we go. Since Guile only has 2 special moves, and there's not a lot of mix-ups from his side that you have to get used to or understand, your basic difficulty against Guile is getting in on him and defending against him, which would have been covered by other bots in other situations. Therefore, the thing you want to learn the most is how do I get in on basically the most tanky defensive character in the game. And once I am in, what can I do with that? The first part of the point system, therefore, is actually a restriction. A way to make this so that you don't end up sitting there waiting the entire time just to see one specific situation and get your points. The reason this is necessary is because a bot does not have the ability to vary its approaches when you become very defensive, so we must force you to play a particular way just to get the fairness into it and to make you try harder at particular things. So the first thing that you should note about this is that if Guilebot uses his V skill, the Sonic Blade, which is the vertical looking cutting motion fireball that stays in front of him, he gets 1 point if that move connects with you at all. If you block it, if you do not jump over it or use one of your fireball gating moves to stop it in some way, which is really difficult because it's normally 2 hits, or something else that allows you to avoid it, you will have to count this as a point for Guile. This forces you to stand at particular ranges, but also that you want to push on him a little bit more than you necessarily would naturally, while at the same time giving you a range at which it is dangerous to stand because you wouldn't be able to react in time to it. Which brings us to the main point system and what bulldogging itself is. Bulldogging is a term used for walking in against a character that has either specifically long but slightly slower pokes or good fireball pressure, and for some reason you don't want to just try to jump the fireballs every time, either due to their spacing or their ability to use defensive moves very well. Bulldogging therefore is walking forward and blocking at the moment where you think the fireball will be thrown, and since most characters have to wait a little while before they throw another one, you get to walk forward a little bit more. It's getting in on the player with that spacing, hitting the buttons you need to hit once you are close enough, and making sure you don't hit anything that can be easily whiff punished either. So the signature of our stream, of our brand, is of course the crouching medium kick. And for most characters in the game, this is the button you will be using for this. In fact, technically the point system could simply say, walk in and hit Guile with your crouching medium kick. The important thing, of course, that you must walk in, otherwise you wouldn't necessarily be learning much. Against a true player, against a CPU, maybe you would have to deal with the potential for being reacted to when you jumped or being set up, but since the bot does not have this capacity, you're going to be mostly limited to the ground. And the third part of the point system is intended to enforce that while still giving you some options. If you jump at Guile and knock him down or hit him with the jump, Guile will also get 1 point. This is purely there so that you can fixate in your head that you shouldn't do this, or that if you do it, it's because you perceive that the situation is going to trade in your favor. That you're going to get 2 crouching medium kick combos off of the 1 jump in neutral. Presumably because you knocked him down and you're done a meaty similar to what just has happened on screen. Or just because you didn't want to deal with some part of his fireball pressure and realized, I want to jump this because if I don't jump this, I could lose altogether. Maybe you're really close to getting the last point and Guile is very far from having any points, and therefore you just use that as the system to get in and finish off the fight. Which is relatively close to reality if you have the situation where Guile is losing and you have a lot of life. You can risk a jump in or two, even if you feel as if you could be baited into being flash kicked or whatever. But the specifics of this come into your style and come into your character's more effective ways of doing these things. Ryu is a character who's very good at clipping people's toes with his crouching medium kick. Chun-Li is also good at this, but there are other characters for whom this isn't as easy, or it basically doesn't work at all with the kick. You might have to use the punch. The important thing is to pick something that you would actually try to use, but that is not actually just so easy that the Guile player would not be able to counter it. So, let's say in the case of Vega or Rainbow Mika, you could in fact give yourself points for using their slides if you wanted to. If you've considered it that your style is to actually try to slide under these things, that's perfectly okay because Guilebot should be able to punish you just often enough to make this regrettable. But it is possible, especially depending on how cleanly the Guilebot was input, that he doesn't really have a good way to deal with that sort of pressure, especially if you space it perfectly right. And you end up having to ask yourself, is this something I would do in a real match? That's where Guilebot's simplicity disappears, and the style of the player using the bot for their own improvement must be taken into account. You have to decide what exactly it is that you try to do against Guile in the first place, and therefore what you should be trying to do to give yourself points. This is one of the bots where the point system itself may not be flexible because it's intended to set up a certain situation, but the actual action that you use to get the points can definitely be flexible. For example, due to the fact that Guile's soul back kick, also known as the upside down kick, actually goes over low attacks, there are times when using your crouching medium kick may not be what you want because he will hit you. Or simply that because crouch blocking is not what he's doing every moment, there are some input points where he is actually stand blocking for a moment. or simply the range of the button, all contribute to what exactly is you personally choose to do against Guile. Now this bot, since it is relatively advanced, even if it's simple in terms of what it's for, you don't get any points for things like crush counter punishing his flash kicks. But you'll note that once again, if you can learn to meaty with very specific moves after basically knocking him down, especially if the move counts toward your style point, you can decide, I'm giving myself the point. I'm giving myself the point because, not because you have done the crush counter combo, but because you have done a crush counter combo that leads into a meaty, and the meaty itself then lets you get the point. The other important part of the bot though is that on some level it trains two other things. One being hit confirms, and two being general Guile matchup stuff, reactions to stuff Guile does. As Amara is now demonstrating, when Guile's upside down kick is blocked, and if he immediately attempts to go into anything directly after it that would actually hit at that range, you can normally clip his feet and you can normally get something out of it. Whether or not your particular character can do that is therefore important to you and important to your decisions. He's also been given the V trigger, but this is not mainly for the purpose of actually using it. This is more so just there to remind you of the feeling of it, and if you want to practice any special things with making sure that you know how to stop his V trigger, or deciding how you're going to block it, or just feeling getting pushed out and how you have to deal with getting back in, those things have been added as well. For this reason, the bot has also been given the capacity to jump, but it is not normally seen because flash hits will normally take up that input. And he's been given the ability to use basically as many EX Sonic Booms as he likes. And that's why you will notice that the bot's gauges are kept at the maximum, whereas the player gauges, if you will notice shortly, actually start with the critical art gauge at max. You can alter this again depending on what you're working on. The V gauge is left in a normal state, but it doesn't tend to come into this training too much. It doesn't actually matter for most characters whether or not it is there or not. If your character's good combos from bulldogging happen to only come off that, then maybe that's what you want. Plus, it's fairly cathartic to just be able to hit them with super occasionally. So in terms of style development, and in terms of what Guile Bot allows you to learn or is for, you're looking for methods of offense that don't necessarily result in Guile Bot being able to push you back out, and you're working on figuring out exactly where to stand such that he doesn't end up getting a lot of points off you by just doing his own V skill as mentioned. He's good at chip damage, but not terribly good. So let's look at this in terms of actually counting some points now. And you'll notice immediately that Guile Bot already has 1 point, even though there's basically, it's possible for him to do no damage to you if your defense is really good. But we're not really looking here for your defense. So he's been pushed back, but again manages to get a point, primarily because of spacing being slightly off. The difficulty in bulldogging with footsie characters, for example, is knowing exactly when to stop walking forward, especially against an opponent who is potentially walking backward. And that is part of the reason why the crouching medium kick and other lows are so important to this. It is good to get into the habit of using that button, because if you've gotten into the right range and your opponent is now reacting to the fact that you've gotten there by trying to change the range just by walking backward, then you can use that button and click their feet and then attempt to hit confirm into something really powerful, or at least something that will keep you at a situation where you want to be and therefore victorious. But as you can see, Guile is not going to make that easy. And he's specifically set up such that for each type of character out there, even grapplers, even though this is a little bit more difficult for them, he has a response to most things. For example, please remember that his upside down kick is in fact throw invincible for the most part, and therefore if he happens to use it while you are walking in on him to throw him, he would in fact be able to deal with you. That said, generally you shouldn't treat this bot as a bot to practice throws against or throw meaties against, because it's not really designed to do that. It tends to just down back. And while that would be very good to learn how to deal with in terms of Guile as a character, a Guile player tends to be a bit more ready for you, whereas with the bot you could learn some patterns and decide how to approach it just to get the throw and defeat most of the purpose of it. Now, it also contains the crouching medium kick, which follows the upside down kick, but if you have knocked it down or forced the bot to block, it can end up just doing the crouching medium kick without any preamble at all. This is meaningful because if you have put yourself too close to the bot and you want to get away from it so that it can't hit you with the B skill and get a point, the crouching medium kick is there so that it can click your feet and end up pushing you out of where you want to be. It's obviously also not really equipped for Fireball Wars, but that's another aspect of the style you can use here. If your character has a good way of dealing with fireballs, especially a good way of evading them, it is actually quite possible to get points by evading and then attempting to deal some form of damage before Guile can block. But this can often be difficult, mainly because the bot specifically tends to block a lot. However, since this is about developing style-based points, that can be a special system you use for yourself. If you have a character who easily evades fireballs and moves in on the opponent, you can simply give yourself a point for either doing that, or if you find that to be too easy, doing that and then a specific thing after that, which will often work because the specific thing after that will normally require a specific spacing as well. And Guilebot, while it does not move around a lot, it throws fireballs at not quite random, but it does throw them at different speeds, and it does throw them at different timings based on where it is in its own shifts. So, while you may have the ability to, say with Vega, EX roll through the fireballs, the question becomes what you can do after that. If you EX roll from too far away, there's a chance that you will either get hit or not be able to do whatever follow-up you've decided will be your own point system, which will cause you to get back to the point of trying to space yourself correctly such that you can possibly react to it or other actions. The current Galbot also has the sweep, as you've just seen, and it has the ability to do its V skill and leave that as a neutral without actually throwing anything through it. Like that. So it's not necessarily easy to know how to react to seeing the V skill on screen, because it could simply not do anything else and you would then use a move intended to go through fireballs and possibly get hit still. And it is also quite likely that when it does that, it has a decent chance of flash kicking soon afterwards. So what you see here is a lot of things similar to whiff punishes, but that may not necessarily be considered to be whiff punishes. And above all, a lot of defense. The main purpose of all this being to train reactions to the few moves that Guile has, because the defense that he has, plus the frames that his defense uses, let you push forward only in certain situations, and once you understand those situations, you can do a lot more damage against Guile in general. Knowing just where to stand to not get hit by his crouching heavy punch, knowing that you can duck under his forward heavy punch, knowing for certain characters that their crouching medium kick is in fact such a long range move that there is a specific range where even if he does his V skill, you can actually clip his legs under it and hit him and then go into your own thing, which will stop him. I wouldn't suggest necessarily trying to do this on reaction, it's a little difficult, but it can be done. But the obvious question would then be, well, what if I just bulldog in and block and wait completely? This is an option that is not only open to you, but it's supposed to be. So you shouldn't feel as if being extremely patient and not attempting to clip his legs based on when you think he will move is in any way bad. This could in fact be, again, your style. I wouldn't say there's specifically any points you could use for it, but if anything, there's probably something you can get off it. And there's possibly a spacing at which you can punish something that he does normally, and then consider that to have given you a point. It all depends on your personal feeling about how close you should be standing to Guile in neutral. And the aim is to train yourself to get to that spot. As all this bot, everything about this bot is toward that end. Getting you to get to that spot and do your best to stay there in the face of sonic booms, flash kicks, and the occasional upside down kick. And once you recognize that that is more or less the sum total of what the general Guile player will do, other than perhaps dash throwing you, you can literally get the muscle memory for knowing where to stand, knowing how far away. It'll get recorded in your brain as a distance that you can do. You can even try, unlike other bots where it's not necessarily so useful, you can try training on different stages, training in different costumes, anything to get as much muscle memory as possible regarding where you need to be on the screen in order to get certain things done. Now, as for other zoning players who are trying to learn to deal with Guile, if you want to create a point system for that type of situation, there is another option that becomes available even if you don't specifically change Galbot. if you want to practice your zoning against Guilebot, all you really have to do is set your own critical art gauge to normal. Or possibly to minimum, but I don't remember if it has that option. No, just normal. The idea here being, you want to try to have a fireball war with Guile, but obviously Guile has unlimited EX Sonic Booms, and you do not have unlimited EX Fireballs of your own. And since you don't really know when he's going to throw one, plus he could simply go over things with your... go over your stuff with his Flash Kick, you can't be absolutely sure. But a lot of the time you can just throw fireballs at Guile, and it's not going to make much difference. You can learn to vary your own fireball timings, but even with the upside down kick in there and those two occasional inputs, the chances are that if you're going on a pure point system and you slightly change the way Guile gets points, namely you getting hit by EX at all, you can turn Guilebot, who is supposed to be a bot about bulldogging in, into a bot mostly about counter zoning. Hitting him with your own fireballs basically becomes the challenge, but his luck and your own awareness of various things, when to block, when to expect different types of fireball and so on, change many things. It also teaches you very effectively at what ranges you can throw a fireball because the opponent has done something other than fireball, or because the opponent has thrown their own. In fact, you can see it easily demonstrated here that if you throw a fireball because Guile has done the upside down kick, or more the medium kick actually, the crouching medium kick is more so the reason for this, but if you see him do the upside down kick and then throw your own fireball, there's a chance that he'll just block it. You can't assume that because he has moved that your own fireball will now be available as an option for doing damage. But you can keep him out. We did, however, give him the medium kick, flash kick, to make this even more difficult. There's some projectile invulnerability on the flash kick in a way that if you try to get through it with the fireball and he just simply reacts with it outright, you may not get anything. You can also obviously, as seen here, attempt to throw your fireball from too close and get clipped by something. So, while he is a bit multi-purpose, I wouldn't necessarily suggest this one except if you were very familiar with Guile as a character and wanting to zone that way, because the point system might be a little bit harder to come up with in full, and furthermore, it's slightly luck related at least, because he could definitely just not throw as many EX Sonic Booms, or he could throw far too many and you'd be unable to do anything about it. That said, counter zoning as a general thing would have been covered mostly in Ryubot because you can know what to expect. But unconventional counter zoning, knowing when to block, knowing when to push yourself, you can definitely adapt Guilebot to it if you have found that Ryubot is either too easy or your character allows you to get away from most of what he does. Korean players, for example, will find that staying at the other side of the screen, waiting for something, and then just doing Rasenha is a decent solution to this, especially as a counter zoning solution. And Guile doesn't have a whole ton he can do about it. Especially since Rasenha will hit him even if he was just crouch blocking the entire time. However, it's fairly obvious that for most Karin players, in the Guile matchup against the real opponent, they'll see a lot less full screen booms, and therefore their focus will in fact have to be on using Karin's powerful footsies to get close, clip his legs in some way, and actually get damage off that. That said, if he does push them all the way out, there's no real reason why a Karin player shouldn't be able to use those to at least evade his projectiles. However, this is fortunately built into the bot in a different way, and therefore wouldn't require you to do too much change mentally to do it. Since evading his V-skill fireball prevents him from getting a point, and jumping over or neutral jumping them is useful but puts you at much more risk, you do get a direct benefit from being able to do that. For people who are not familiar with the Guile matchup, he's also useful for just learning the basics of punishing his flash kick specifically, and you can vary him or change his inputs very slightly to give him the capacity to do ES flash kick, though obviously with the current settings this would cause him to do it all the time. Also, he is our first bot for whom option action side is not specifically required anyway, so if you realize that your particular playstyle means that you become susceptible to Guile dashing in and throwing you, then you can simply change the input, and this will be listed as a variant on our site to mk.org when the Guile bot is available, probably at the end of this weekend. Fortunately, there's not a whole lot that needs to be finalized about him, and it will be mostly just variants and specific explanations, or just random ideas that the team has come up with as to how exactly they or other people they know with different characters can maximize their training against Guile using this particular bot. What we know from efforts among the team thus far is that it is definitely helpful in understanding what your character will get away with. Even if you don't necessarily get the points, you will tend to learn a range at which you're safer from most things, and that is a very important thing to know in this match, especially since the way that Guile treats the jump-in game from his own side, it can be frustrating to players who are not used to having the option of jumping in so cleanly shut down relative to their normal playstyle. If you play against Guilebot for long enough, it's quite possible that you will simply stop thinking of jumping in as an option for the match in general, which is likely to save you a lot of damage. And then the moments where you think, okay, this really is a good idea, I should definitely jump in now. If you've been playing long enough on the ground, there is a chance that the Guile player will not be ready with the flash kick. Especially if you were defensive and they were trying to open you up themselves. The final thing you can use Guilebot for, in very specific ways, is learning to set up your own cross-up jump-in, if your character happens to have any of those. While we do have a bot in the works that will definitely work specifically for that, the reason this is important for Guilebot, even though he has basically no defense against it, is because if you are specifically aiming for cross-ups and not just jump-ins, then you must get to the space where you can jump to do the cross-up. Either by knocking him down and placing him in that situation, or moving far enough forward that when you do jump, it will count as a cross-up. And this, again, does not specifically require a large change to the point system. Primarily because there are three things to take into account here. The first is that since Guile is generally crouch blocking, if you happen to have one of those characters whose better jumping combos don't work on crouching opponents, such as... We can definitely consider Ryu's target combo to be better, even if only because it leads to cleaner meaties that leave Ryu mostly safe. He does have others, but many characters do have that situation of one of their combos being slightly more difficult to do on cross-up because maybe it's done with their light button and therefore the opponent does not have to worry as much and can sometimes just block if you drop the combo. Or it's difficult to space, or they don't take the damage fully when they happen to be crouching, and so on. The difficulty here then is simply getting to that space. And all you have to do to make that difficult on yourself is retain the original perspective. If you happen to land in the front and hit him, then once again Guile gets the point. You get your points for getting the cross-up correct, and Guile will get his points if you mess it up. Obviously all the while worrying about whether or not you're being flash kicked enough. Now for various reasons, Guilebot is not one of those bots for whom we have used many quick rise options within his inputs. They can be added, but given the minimalistic input setup, he generally will not have too many of them, even if you make a fair amount of effort to put them in, since mostly it will be just the upside down kick input, possibly that crouching medium kick, and expect that when the bot is released on the site, given that those inputs are relatively easy, that those will be given as medium kick, light kick, rather than just medium kicks, in order to make it more likely that he can actually do it. But obviously, since we don't want him throwing EX booms all the time, the punches are going to be less so. Fortunately, for the purposes involved here, especially when it comes to cross-ups and setting up cross-ups, Guile back rolling is technically better than Guile quick rising. So for now, that covers all of the main ways that we intended for Guilebot to be used outright. And the variants will again be available on the 2-mk.org site when the Guilebot is released. I expect to see it within 2 to 3 days, as there isn't too much to finalize. Now we'll be moving into the second segment of this particular stream. Style itself, how to apply it relative to things you learn from bots, and most importantly, how to use a bot that was not necessarily set up for the opponent you just fought to change or work on a particular thing that you encountered in a match while in ranked or casuals, with the bot being what you are running in the background while waiting for matches. You can maximize your training time by understanding how to use a bot that you are already on that doesn't necessarily have the purpose or setup that matches the character you fought. How to turn that bot into what you need to deal with whatever problem came up in the last match. without generally changing the bot at all. So in this case, we'll consider it to be all about mindset and about player style. Dalbot is probably one of our best bots for this, since he has no specific focus other than defending himself and keeping you out. But many of our other bots can be used for this as well, especially if they are within the moderate and basic categories. Advanced bots, generally if you're having a problem that an advanced bot fixes, you actually need to have that particular advanced bot be the one that you're normally using while waiting for matches, because those weaknesses tend to be fairly blatant or matchup specific, and you should work on them as soon as possible, because the bots in those cases are much more targeted and not so much about mindset stuff. So right now, we're going to turn on ranked and possibly casual matches as well, with the standard settings 4 to 5 bars, and ask to make sure that we don't get cheated by the system. And we're going to use this to learn both how to play a particular style and how to use your bot effectively, even though it may not be the bot for the situation you encounter. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the CFN beta update and the solutions to this particularly long loading time. I seem to remember this person by name, but I often think I remember people by name. But for now, all we hope is that it doesn't lag. So during the last open mic session, if you have not seen it, Justfine and Kanzuki Dynasty were going over some of the specifics of Amara's style development at the moment, and certain flaws that appear because of basically not believing in certain things. We're not seeing that problem here, of course, because she has been working on it. But we are definitely seeing an Akuma that is not afraid to do more shoryus than is strictly necessary. Now, as we know from Akuma Bot, he has the ability to vary his approaches in the air quite heavily, and this can easily give people a lot of issues with feeling comfortable in the match. This is primarily because we don't generally want to defend against Akuma as much as is necessary. But it is necessary. Until you have trained heavily certain reactions probably against the Akuma bot itself, or just in general, it's very difficult to beat Akuma in ranked, because the Akuma player is the one at the advantage. Generally, the attacking player is at advantage primarily because they already know what they're going to do. They are the one who is in control of the mix-up. You are the one that has to decide, what do I think they're going to do and can I react in time to it? Unfortunately, since we are not yet on patch, it is not simply safe to wait up with Light Shoryuken as a general way out of Akuma pressure. And since Amara has not had much experience with Akuma Bot, it can become difficult to get ready for the things he does, given that his meaty pressure is generally so good. The other reason is that most of Amara's style does not specifically do well in terms of countering Akuma. Amara plays very patiently, likes to parry things, and likes to move to a particular spot in neutral and hit standing heavy punch. But against Akuma, he has so many mix-ups that get through parries and alter the way that he moves in neutral to the point where it's difficult to just punch him in the face, that you have to take a certain amount of risk in order to do it.
Round one. Fight.
Now the risk can be extremely calculated, but it's still a risk. And it's difficult to become comfortable with the idea that you could just get this wrong flatly. There's no way to get it right based on some pre-understood or predetermined knowledge. Mostly you just keep blocking and hope for a lot of things to happen. But in terms of how one could ever use this sort of bot, namely Guile, to train reactions that would somehow help you against Akuma, this would probably seem very difficult if not impossible, given that they're specifically almost opposite ends of the spectrum in this game. Here we have one who is jumping consistently and doing things like that. So you wouldn't immediately think, well, okay, when this match is over, regardless of how I've done, I'm going to go back to my Guile bot and use Guile bot to solve problems I had in the match. You would generally think I should be fighting Akuma bot. But if you look carefully at what this specific player tries to do with their movement, there may be a way to use it. The key being that in order for this Akuma to play the way they're playing, they have to really trust that jump in. And really trusting that jump in to that level requires that they feel as if they have control of the neutral enough to jump. So, we have two ways that we can make use of this. The first is learning to Shoryuken through certain things. The second is to check the pressure reaction you have when the opponent is at a particular range, and even though Guile doesn't jump at that range, you could simply do whatever it is that you should do against an Akuma at that range. It's not necessarily correct or incorrect. The bot may beat you, the bot may no longer be serving its own direct purpose, but you could still get yourself to do certain things. So in this case, rather than using crouching medium kick to deal with Guile, you could move into a space where you're trying to punish things with Light Shoryuken. And use that to figure out, can you do Light Shoryuken under pressure? Because the pressure part of the bot is about the same. Then it becomes a matter of figuring out which aspect of the bot you can use that against, and therefore recreating your own temporary point system. As we see here, Guilebot basically can only be hit with a Light Shoryuken probably after the upside down kick. Or right there. So it is entirely possible to make that your condition. Even though the Light Shoryuken does not hit, it does, however, completely evade his follow-up crouching medium kick right afterward. Which means that if you are looking for the correct situation where you have been hit by upside down kick and then react with Light Shoryuken, you can at least get yourself to feel a situation under which you are doing Light Shoryuken in a pressure feeling. Now with Ryu, it's probably going to be easier to convert whatever happens in this match to things you could practice against Guilebot.
Round one. Fight.
In fact, this particular Ryu seems to be effectively Guilebot, with a little more jumping. And in this case, this allows you to use that piece of information to push them back and lead them into thinking that they need to jump at this particular range. Or that you can get to a particular range and yourself do a cross-up. But you will note that the overall situation is very similar to Guilebot in that you're trying to get to a very specific space. The difference being that it might not be the same space. Once you have control of that space, doing things like that becomes easier. Because of course, bulldogging does not apply only to characters throwing fireballs. Bulldogging is at least applicable, if not an actual component of footsie. So regardless of how this match overall goes, as mentioned before, it wouldn't necessarily feel as if you needed to change too much about it. If anything, you would change your regular training session with Guilebot to potentially include more cross-ups, jumping after crouching medium kicks, and so on. Because we can expect that their defense is going to be very similar. Knowing exactly when to jump is just as important as knowing when not to jump.
Round 2. Fight.
So we're seeing similar to the counter zoning strategies here as well. Unfortunately, that didn't work quite as planned. And obviously if you find that you have issues with combos or doing combos that get you punished, most bots don't really have enough actual movement or defense that you need to worry about that. Rather than doing them on a standing dummy, basically any bot is useful enough. You might learn a little bit about the interactions of that particular combo with the particular character. So we've got the opponent Ryu moving away here, which isn't the same as Guile in general, but the response to it shouldn't be all that different overall, in terms of when you can get your damage. So for example here, if Amara wanted to make use of Guilebot to get a feeling or just some catharsis as to how that particular match went, stuff like mixing up things on jump-ins could be a good option. Since he doesn't have throw defense, that doesn't really come up. But different cross-ups, different block strings that leave you at different spaces after cross-ups, all of these things can be practiced on a bot, especially a bot like Guile, without changing the feeling too much. And if you happen to have time to look up some new combo or similar, you can again check what this particular combo does against this bot in this situation and so on. Fortunately, if you have as good internet as we do here, it doesn't take too long for more matches to come. But that also is important. The fact that even the small amounts of time you get to use between matches can at least help you feel out what happened in the match, what you might want to work on later, what you just didn't do well because you were under pressure. And the bot recreates the pressure enough to have something happen. So now we've got an unranked Colleen in casuals, but the fact that they're in casuals means that you can't necessarily know how good they really are, other than to look at their level. So we've got level 12. Generally a level 12 player is presuming that they played the story. A level 12 player for a character probably knows some basics and how to throw out some combos. And your job would then be to avoid the combos as much as you can. Fortunately, style-wise, this is easily solved because Amara gets to do her absolute favorite thing, because Colleen is weak relatively to zoning. And while she's not easy to keep out altogether because of her slight ability to vary her jump-ins, if you can push her far enough out, it doesn't really come up again. We do have some slight lag apparently, presumably because of just distance and ping overall. Some issues with mix-ups, but this generally isn't too bad when you are playing online, especially in casuals, because it's mostly going to come down to learning a player's patterns and taking a bit more damage than you would have otherwise if your reactions could have covered the situation. Another important thing to generally deal with.
Round 2. Fight.
However, if you find that you have problems actually doing certain of your combos within lag, generally this is not something that should be happening to most people, because most combos don't have enough specific confirms to require this. Maybe certain things for certain charged characters. I know that there are certain Chun-Li combos that become difficult to do in lag because of having to mentally confirm a particular part of the hit, but you can usually do most of them overall. If you find it difficult to do punishes in lag, that is almost certainly not your fault. But a combo overall that doesn't require much of a hit confirm, you can generally use share play with a friend who owns the game. Share play lag tends to be a bit worse in terms of the amount of lag there is. It can get to start feeling like you're playing underwater, but you're not really trying to learn to react in lag. You're just trying to learn to trust your combos enough to do them without worrying about it. And if you learn that there's a particular combo you can't pull off due to lag, then you'll quickly learn that and then not do it anymore, presumably. You can have a whole repertoire of stuff you turn on and off based on how laggy it is. Now this Colleen player seems to know very well that Colleen is relatively zonable and therefore can't just stay back against Ryu. I guess they learned a bit from it in the first place. And that brings us back to looking into how to use the Guile bot to get something out of that. Which again, is similar to Akuma. It would seem to be fairly difficult.
Fight.
But in the case of Guilebot, one of the main things that comes up is the fact that he's not very good at doing damage from particular ranges. He can control a lot of space, but damage is not so much. Colleen has a similar problem. She has to consistently do a particular thing, or try to make a lot of effort to get to a very specific range. And it's easy for her to mess up something and end up in a situation like this. But getting used to Colleen's buttons and Colleen's crouching medium kick, for example, isn't that hard from dealing with Guile in the same spacing. You learn to respect it, you learn which move you need to respect, and then mentally simulate that move in some way. Can I throw fireballs after this move, for example? Similarly, there are pressure strings Colleen uses where V-reversal is the answer. And you could train yourself on any bot to do V-reversal stuff if you knew what you were doing. So converting Guilebot into how could I keep Colleen from dealing damage to me at that range is just a matter of changing your perspective on what Guilebot is trying to do, even though you don't change what Guilebot is actually doing. Guile is safe after a regular Sonic Boom, and you're supposed to respect it. Colleen is basically safe after her crouching medium kick at max range, and you're again supposed to respect it. But safe does not mean that if they try to take another action, that you don't have something that can beat them. And the question is, what is the something you should be looking for? So, while most of what we've done so far with Guilebot has involved hitting things when he does the upside down kick, it is possible to stand at a particular range where you could throw a Hadouken after it. And learning that range where you won't get clipped by the crouching medium but get the Hadouken off might not be the exact same range as being clipped by Colleen. But you can spend a couple seconds mentally telling yourself, okay, I need to be here in order to do this. With Guile, I need to be here in order to do this. And it will just help you bring the Colleen experience forward with you so that you remember that sort of thing in the next match if it comes up. We're back to another Ryu mirror. And as usual, we're not really sure how much this person is going to be a specific type of Ryu before we start. Ryu tends to be very versatile. Hopefully, when patch comes, he'll be even more versatile.
Round one. Fight.
So what we've seen from this Ryu so far is that they like to jump with heavy kick, and shutting that down is probably going to at least slow them a little bit. Now, as mentioned in the previous open mic segment, one problem Amara has in this sort of matchup is basically worrying that the opponent is eventually going to neutral jump. Or empty jump. Depending. Like that. But the situation that creates is usually not a losing situation if you have done it the last 2 or 3 times they actually jumped in with the button. Let's hope that was on their side, because I don't think that the rage quit system is quite working right yet. And I've been the victim of points dropping randomly when it thinks it was me. Does not look like that this time. So I'm going to hope that they also didn't lose points depending on what it was, because I don't think that they were actually like losing out there. Now, while it's very difficult to feel that when it comes to Guilebot, there is a way to do it if you try really hard. Effectively speaking, you could tell yourself every time Guile does anything that looks like a Sonic Boom, I'm going to parry it, because I'm going to expect it is a Sonic Boom. And get yourself used to the feeling of, okay, that wasn't a Sonic Boom, or it was a Sonic Boom that was too fast, or it led into something that I thought it was not going to be. And just get yourself used to the feeling of, I'm taking this damage. I'm taking this damage because my alternative would be taking more damage, or being in a situation I don't want to be in. I'm taking this damage because this damage is not the damage that puts me in the bad situation. Now, I'm looking at a Korean flag. I'm looking at a level 1 Ken on PC rookie with a Korean flag. And I'm actually having faith in Capcom's matching algorithm. Now, I know it seems unreal because it could either be that they are in the US or somewhere within a good ping range and just have a Korean flag. This is a strange thing to be allowed to do, but what can you do? People move around. Alternately, maybe they're just on spectacular internet and the matching system says, you know what? This really is someone who you can fight. Because this does happen. I still haven't gotten back in touch with that person from the Seychelles. But then again, I promised I would get back to them when my Colleen was better, and Sandbag Casuals requires that my Colleen not be too much better. So, while this person is not Kenbot, they do a bit more footsies and are not as likely to randomly jump. The things that one learns against our Kenbot are generally useful here regardless. But Ken is actually fairly difficult for Amara to face in her particular style because Kens are not easily zoned. You can do it, but they have enough counter zoning tactics that will lead to you taking damage that you shouldn't mess around with it too much. And then when you try to use these zoning knockdowns and similar to get close, he has slightly better range than Ryu in a lot of situations. Which means that the part of her style which she has to use is the most hair-raising part to use, namely parrying in neutral. This usually leads to a quick death because it's a very hard skill to practice, and we don't have a bot that particularly shows it. However, you will note that the same bulldogging strategy, while it does not specifically solve the problem, it does set up the same sort of scenarios. You could, rather than walking forward and using the crouching medium kick immediately, as soon as you find yourself feeling, if I try to crouching medium kick here, I'm going to get hit. And if you're really that sure that you're going to get hit, then you could parry. Of course, as I said, this is extremely hair-raising thing to do. And hitting the parry just once, for many players, can be really difficult. Because it's a really weird pressure situation. But it allows you to train a different feeling. If you realize you walk forward a couple of times, and the parry comes too late, or the parry wouldn't have made any sense, then it also means that you could have hit the crouching medium kick. Probably. That way of training yourself to see the failure of one thing as an indicator for the success of another is something you can use both against bots and people. Usually quite effectively. So going with the same bulldogging strategy as before overall, if you realize, hey, I'm not actually getting my parry to work because I'm hitting it too early, or they're walking back and forward and I'm not actually parrying at all, then you could simply say to yourself, well, you know what, maybe bulldogging will work more on this person, at least for a little while. Because they don't seem to be the sort of person who throws out buttons to stop me from walking and doing crouching medium kick on them. If they were doing that, then presumably the parry would be working. And you'll note that if they aren't that sort of person, but you parry at the wrong time, chances are that they didn't actually hit anything to stop you. And Ryu's parry, while it does have a long recovery, if you generally hit it around the same time as the other person hits the button, and then just block, it's very unlikely that he'll actually get hurt, because they have to react to the fact that you parried, which is really difficult. So here we see them moving in a way that involves pressing buttons. And now they're going to probably try to put on more pressure. But the previous situation, the previous system was basically going fine. And, more importantly, This is allowing us to get back to possibly a Ken that could be zoned. Changing the flow of these things matters a lot. But once again, in terms of how you could use this, technically there's not so much that would need to be used in the first place. But if you wanted to become more comfortable with just parrying in neutral, to get the feel for when does my parry end, when is the optimal time to press it relative to when I would have pressed another button, and all of those things, once again, nearly any grounded bot will help you do this. Our super specific advanced bots such as Zangief bot and potentially Dalsim bot once it's complete, maybe they aren't so good for it, but to some extent, even Ryu and Ken bot can be used for this, even though most of their attacks don't work that way in neutral. So you could make your points about, I'm walking close enough to you and I think you're going to attack now, so I'm going to parry the attack, and get used to the feeling of, am I hitting my parry too early? Or am I hitting it too late? What is a parry in neutral supposed to feel like? The same thing happens for Bison, even though Bison's timing is different. The same thing happens for Fang, even though Fang's is mostly about avoiding. Characters like Karin and Ibuki who use footsie buttons for this, it doesn't apply to them because they probably wouldn't have had the problem in the first place. So you never need to feel that. They would have ended up with some other problem in that matchup. Presumably the Ken would have adapted. And then they would have had to come up with a way to make Guilebot work for that. But you can take this piece of information and go, well, I don't feel as if I know the parry timing on a bot I've been fighting. Therefore, it's not strange that I can't do it in a match, or that I find a particular part of it difficult. And that's another reason why bots and the checking of your own skill sets for particular things using bots is so important. It's easy to get down on yourself when you feel as if you should have been able to do something in a match because you know conceptually how it should be done or what should be done. But you can use the bot to test, I know how to do this, but can I actually do it? Can I actually do it consistently enough that I should be here saying to myself, well, I should have done so much better in that match. Now it might be really discouraging to realize, no, you definitely couldn't have done better in that match and that was going to happen regardless. But at least then you know, at least then you don't feel, oh, I got beaten by a rookie Ken from across the world and I don't know what I did wrong. It wasn't a matter of doing a particular thing wrong, it's just a matter of the specific style that they have requires something you haven't practiced or don't feel comfortable using yet. With Cammy we see that this is easily possible as well, because Amara's style against Cammy and Karin and other footsie characters often involves literally just punching them in the face.
Round 2.
Once they've gotten used to the idea that she will punch them in the face, then other things can be done. You'll note that that button is actually like -1, I think, or is it +1? I believe it's -1, and therefore, if you are feeling comfortable in neutral, if you feel like you have the spacing right, you really can just hit Ryu standing heavy punch. It preempts a lot of things and just feels comfortable, and it has great pushback, so it's not as if most people can immediately go, okay, I'm gonna hit my greatest button now. They may need to dash in. There may be some mix-ups you'll fall into, but you don't have to worry as much as you would for certain things. Now this Kami, for example, isn't really a Kami that would make me say, oh, it looks like you're not used to this, you should probably fight Kami Bot for a while. They're doing some things that Kami Bot does, but the timings that they do them in, they're not just spamming them, they are being relatively intelligent about when the things are done. So you won't notice the feeling of, this is a terrible idea, this is a great idea. It's just going to be whatever it is at the moment. So then you have to work out a strategy for dealing with Kami being at that range, that one specifically, that doesn't leave Ryu too vulnerable to other things. And Kami Bot would definitely not be the bot for that, in fact. Because Kami Bot doesn't stay at that range, and many Kami don't stay at that range. But the disadvantage of that range is seen here in that it's relatively harder for Kami to get her offense started. Perhaps they move to that range in anticipation of the standing heavy punch, wishing to whiff punish it, which we saw them do at least once. Or just because it seemed like a good idea. But this is another aspect of style that can be used strongly to your advantage, actually. If you do a certain thing often enough to make your opponent try to counter it, and you know your own style well enough, it becomes easy to recognize when your opponent has moved to counter you, and then stop doing the thing. So it is possible to condition this Kami to wait for the standing heavy punch by doing it often enough to cause that reaction. At which point, the standing heavy punch itself has not solved anything. Generally, they will not get hit, they will try to whiff punish it, they may get away with the whiff punish. But you made them do that. You made them focus on something you do that they think will help them. And if you get really good at it, you can basically reverse the situation. Do the heavy punch, which manages quite well against most moves, at a range where they can't whiff punish it, and then prepare to hit another button that would deal with whatever they were punished with. This Kami, for example, right now is reacting to the stand heavy punch by dashing or doing crouching medium kick. However, Amara's general stance and style put her at a position where neither of those things is actually all that guaranteed to work. So it is possible to just do stand heavy punch and make them react, and take that moment of making them react to do something else. Of course, training that sort of thing, especially when you're already thinking about it and everything else in the match they could be doing, can be really difficult. But if you know your own style really well and get used to it, it stops being so difficult. And that's how style evolves in general.
Final round. Fight.
So stand heavy punch there, and we see that the person's reactions for the whiff punish, if you don't hit it too often, they're not necessarily going to be ready for it in the first place. If you do it at a semi-predictable spacing, you can do stuff like that. Because they'll think, okay, it's my turn now, but depending on what button they want to hit and what button you have available to you, again, they're trying to react within this game's limitations of lag, spacing, difficulty with frames, all sorts of things. So you can control a situation quite heavily with that sort of thing alone. And even though it would seem, well, why would I hit this punch here? Clearly Kami can whiff punish me in general. What if you turn that on its head and go further so that you know they can whiff punish you, so you don't hit it in the place where it would ever have hit them. Just make them react. Because many players cannot do that. It is an extremely difficult skill to recognize when your opponent has done something out of the ordinary and still react in time to do the correct thing. In this case now we're seeing this Cammy acting a lot more in the way that the bot would work, hitting a lot of buttons in neutral and then dashing in. So now I would say, oh well, you have to get used to Cammy bot if you want to beat them when they play like this. And since Mara hasn't had a whole lot of Cammy bot practice, there's not a lot of feelings as to this is what I can do here. However, you can go back to solving the problem with one of her own favorite things. Just throw the Hadouken at the point where they have done a particular method of coming in or a particular form of footsies. Right there, for example, it probably would have worked. Even if it doesn't hit them, it pushes them back out and has them have to start all over. Also, apparently crouching medium punch hits from there. So right there you could do it, and just the knowledge that you might throw the Hadouken then makes them want to jump, which you could parry instead. It's not easy to keep up with all of this, especially when you're playing against a character that you're not too familiar with as a general thing. But if you focus your style enough into a particular form, the uncertainties disappear, and only things like completely surprising situations will start to get to you. At the end of the day, the Cammy approached in 3 ways, and there was technically a way to cover all 3 ways, but it's a matter of style, practice, and confidence to be able to do that on demand. If we are going to say, for example, we're going back to Guilebot and we want to figure out how to make that work there, we could look at the range at which you could hit Stand Heavy Punch, at which Guile's responses don't hit you. Aside from Flash Kick, because Flash Kick is itself. Like that. But there may in fact be such a range. Also, that is interesting to know. That is not it, apparently. At least with regards to the upside down kick, that was not it. But again, the key is mainly to take the feeling from the last match into the bot, regardless of what the bot is. This is why there are certain bots that are better as foundations, and why we are going to strive to get the Guile bot to be available soon. Fortunately, Guile bot is relatively easy to input, but of course there are those of us who have not bought Guile, and other bots will be required for the same situations. We have a new Ken. So the question is, does this Ken play anything like the last Ken? Does this Ken play anything like Kenbot? What are we looking at in terms of how Ken's style, this Ken style, interacts with the Mara style? And is the lag going to be enough to actually do anything with it at all? Looks like we're fine for the most part. For those who don't know, when you get lag at the beginning of matches like this, on PC opponents it may not mean anything. On PS4 opponents it generally means that it's going to be laggy. Okay, well, the first thing we know about this Ken is that they are definitely willing to show you can in certain situations, and that appears to currently be 2 situations that mostly involve people being close to them. Ow! We're seeing a little bit of variation though. So, what do we know so far about them? They like to jump in and back out to zone, and as soon as they feel pressured, the Shoryuken scramble is real. Normally this sort of player is relatively easy to beat, but maybe your particular style doesn't allow that to be so. Because it is entirely possible for this to be something that your style does not be. It's easy to feel like you don't know what you're doing if you are beaten by someone who basically spams shoryukens and sweeps in neutral, but no. It could simply be that it's so unexpected, it's so far outside of what your style naturally covers that you have to do all this work to do this. So even though Amara's style handles this easily, this is partially because Amara is actually fairly defensive as a player, and therefore it doesn't really come up. It doesn't occur to her to specifically push on an opponent who is doing Shoryuken in scramble situations. Okay, they're picking that back up, fortunately. So her ability to be patient and not feel as if her character needs to win by doing pressure means that, for the most part, if she can push this opponent into the situation where they feel the need to Shoryuken, she can beat them because they will Shoryuken. But that, for example, works. A combo drop will lead to the same situation. Not expecting a sweep after that is an extremely important thing that I would almost call it a tactic. And that is partly why Kenbot has the requirement that you be able to punish that specific sequence. Because if you aren't, what Ken can do after it can be really frustrating. But as you can see, I don't think there's going to be a lot of things to take away from this match that Guilebot will then require. Wow, we're all the way to freeze, are we? This is something you don't see very often because in order for the game to freeze to that level, it requires a very specific thing to happen in the netcode. I'm not expert enough to say exactly what that thing is, even though I have some understandings of them. I wouldn't want to steer anyone wrong and tell them nonsense. But I can definitely tell you that for it to freeze, a very specific thing has to happen in the netcode. And you'd think, well, the netcode's terrible, but no. That specific thing happens, as far as I understand it, in basically all netcodes. You can't get away from the thing that causes that. It just causes different things to happen in different forms of netcode. So you'll see again that to Amara there was no I need to get in and finish this off. She just is willing to block out and wait because generally she has confidence that her defense is good enough that if she gets stuck back at neutral, the opponent isn't necessarily going to clutch out a win, even on Ken. I'm being informed by OmniRabbit, who, let's just say he works with the internet, that the reason that happens is a very sudden, extremely high packet loss, Wi-Fi interference, signal drops, congestions at the source or somewhere out in the backbone. So, yeah, just as a general let's only rag on Capcom for things they actually didn't do right vibe, you can't do much about that. And the interesting thing is that because of the way it works, your opponent generally won't get too much advantage out of it either. Because it's not really that it's rolling back or that anything they're sending is getting through. It's basically all going to get dropped. And then a lot of stuff is going to happen all at once. So, unless they manage to walk up and throw you, you shouldn't worry too much about it. Alright, depending on what this is, the fact that the matches are coming fast, and we've basically said all there is to say about both Guilebot and how to use bots to get particular feelings to carry over from your matches and therefore keep in the mindset so you can learn something. Since all of that has been basically dealt with, this is likely to be either the last set or the second to last set, depending on the opponent. And we have a Canadian Juri, a relatively high-ranked Canadian Juri. Now, there is no Juri bot at the moment, and even if there was one, it mostly would be similar to Guilebot, actually, not because Juri doesn't have a lot of variety, but because of the parts of the variety that you need to care about involve a lot more technical information, learning block strings and so on. I mean, just like Chun-Li bot prototype, you could put all those block strings in, but the point system would be complicated and you'd then have to learn them if anyone ever varied them, so on. So, as for how Amara's style generally interacts with Juri, that's a little bit easier to understand. She can't throw projectiles as often because if Juri is far enough away, Ryodan Satsu is an easy solution to them. And because her jump in is so good, she's very likely to get over them relative to other characters. So it ends up with Amara's style being reduced quite a lot to defense and parrying in a very specific space in neutral and huge punishes, as you're about to see. Using the projectiles correctly, however, does help a lot with the match because it makes Juri stay in a particular space, and the player normally expects you to throw the second one. That's probably the key in terms of her style and in terms of anyone who plays a heavy projectile based style. Not necessarily zoning, because zoning Juri is a different matter altogether. What you generally want is to throw them just often enough to make her jump, and because of the range that she'll jump from, she has to hit a button. And as soon as you've gotten Juri to the point where she has to hit the button because she has jumped, you can parry her. But keeping her exactly there is quite hard. The fortunate part is that the last part of this style comes in right there. Juri doesn't want to cross up for you. Juri wants to jump from a very specific range, but that range is exactly the range where even if she jumps with her heavy kick, and if she chooses to jump with anything else to make it easier, standing heavy punch will just work. So once again, Amara's style is in a circle or triangle, depending how you want to look at it, that is able to solve the problem, at least in the initials. Juri doesn't want to be too far away, and Juri doesn't want to be too close.
Round one. Fight.
So if you throw the Hadouken and it keeps her far away, you're good. If she's really far away, you can always parry, and if she isn't quite that far away, you can always hit the standing heavy punch. That particular range is a little bit harder because you have to parry it, but they could neutral jump. But since Juri can win this fight mostly off neutral buttons and jump-ins, it becomes a little bit difficult. If she gives you the full space, then you can just throw your fireballs and expect that you are safe, except for obviously Ryodan Satsu itself. But right there are a lot of responses you can have to her jump. And obviously, as you've seen, the counter response is to jump yourself. If you try to play with any one part of this, the player will adapt most of the time. If you play with all three at once, then they have to think constantly, and the feeling of you being the one who's under pressure gets to go away somewhat. Juri's cross-ups can be good for damage, but you don't have to worry about it as much if the player isn't sure if they are gonna land it or not. Right, and the reversal gets them back off to the same space you wanted them at, and it becomes possible to throw fireballs again. So here we see the adaptation of I'm now going to dash and throw and that will solve my problems. But it doesn't innately solve the problem. The one problem here I would say is that Juri has such a long jump range that she's probably one of the few characters who back throw into Hadouken means you will get nothing at all. Now many characters can quick rise and jump after the back throw Hadouken, but it's basically only Juri, Alex, and to some extent Zangief who can actually do something that will hit you and get good stuff off it. Alex and Juri are probably the best equipped for this. And it's very important to know this if you're going to be fighting them in particular ways. So this match is basically going to come down to how comfortable Amara is with watching Juri's jumping range, understanding the background in this stage and the fact that she's wearing colors that sort of blend in. All those sort of things affect how well you can anti-air certain characters. But again, the question becomes, how do you take this sort of thing out of the match with you into the bot that you were using at the time? Well, the primary problem that you could see was if they're at this range, do this, if they're at this range, do that. And because Galbot obviously has such things that it can be done, and we know that it will go through fireballs with its flash kick, you can still use this to form at least some semblance of a minigame. The question becomes, is there a distance at which you can throw a fireball at Guile in neutral where it will hit him out of the flash kick? Based on your own feelings. In fact, this is fairly important for a lot of things. Since you can learn a bot's rhythm overall, you can learn there's a specific point at which I can respond to a thing that you do and use that moment to throw the fireball. So you go back to zoning range, see something that gets done, react to the something, and see if you have a chance of clipping them out of their own next move. The good part here being that Guilebot will in fact do something that moves him forward and changes the spacing. Now for you, you could easily say, well, I'm just going to dash back and see if that reestablishes the space that I wanted, but he can keep moving. So even in that, you can manage to give yourself enough space to feel out a particular thing based on something you're reacting to. Unfortunately, you're generally not reacting too much when it comes to Juri at long range because she doesn't actually have to press any buttons to be a threat. But she does have to charge for most of her damage, and you could learn some stuff relative to Fuhajin charges. Cookie Monster is in the house. Let this be our final battle. So the Ibuki matchup requires a very specific modification to Amara's natural style, but it's not one that you see too much of because it's neither easy to do nor likely to come up too often because it requires meter. If an Ibuki plays with a lot of mix-ups, then they are going to stand at a range where their aim is to clip you with their V-skill or dash in past you, or hit you with that if you try to throw fireballs at them. Now, most of this is covered in Amara style already, but a lot of it is taken up with the need to use meter on EX Tatsu. Because Ibuki is relatively naturally defeated by this move in neutral, she can block out of it, but the range it puts her at makes it difficult for a lot of things that she wants to happen to actually happen. And for those who are not aware, that move has really good range. It does not look it because you expect that it will hit when the kick hits, but all of you Street Fighter Alpha fans and old school players know that Ryu's Super Hurricane Kick, as it was back in those games, does have a suck-in effect. This game does not necessarily recreate it. I mean, we could check, but I don't think it does any movement on the opponent at all. But to compensate, it allows you a lot of leeway and a lot of room to hit the opponent with it. And because Ibuki is generally not a character who can react to that immediately with a lot of things, probably Raida is the main one, it's not so easy to do that and end up losing as a result of doing that alone, that is. You'll get clipped like that sometimes, but it's not really something you care about too much. So you'll notice that they basically had to use all of their meter to take that round, almost entirely because of the threat of those two things. Shoryuken in a particular range and the Tatsu itself. It also saves you from having to do a lot of things in neutral that would normally be easily punishable or avoidable by Ibuki. And therefore gives you a lot more space, especially if she doesn't have meter at the time.
You lose. Round one. Fight.
So this is the final match of the night, and the opponent might be away. So the key point here being that they'll try to put on pressure for much longer now. And since again, Amara doesn't really have a whole setup for how to specifically parry Ibuki stuff, that part of her style doesn't get used as much, but that one does. And the important part about that being the further away she can keep Ibuki in general, the easier it is to control the match. Because it's hard for Ibuki to fluster you into making mistakes when you basically have her so far away from you that you can't get flustered. Your aim being to fluster them instead.
Round two. Fight.
And other poking buttons in neutral are now usable primarily because they are no longer feeling as comfortable in the space they normally are comfortable in. And the Yatatsu is what allows that to be a thing, because they end up in those situations, and because they end up in those situations and stop being willing to just hit buttons randomly,
You win.
then you can clip them with other buttons. You can poke them even with standing heavy kick, as shown before. It's not as safe as you'd like against Ibuki, but it does do something that will give you advantage enough and help you rebuild your meter so that you are left with enough space and time to actually do that. The rematch is good, so here we go for the final.
Fight.
Unfortunately, none of this manages to set up the situation in which throwing Hadoukens is right back to being a good idea. But overall movement gets opened up by that part of the style. Because the Ibuki player from longer ranges could keep up their pressure were it not for that move, or standing medium kick, but standing medium kick will usually lead to them still being able to do something because they could walk away from it more easily, they could just block it and be pushed out to a range they want to be at, whereas yes, Tatsu pushes them to a range they don't want to be at, right there. They have to start all over, and basically lets you push back on them better. So the key here was, again, building up enough to get out of the pressure if the pressure starts. Or to control neutral in that way. Because keeping control of neutral is just as important and needs to be considered as an option sometimes. Just make your opponent uncomfortable, make them stay closer, so on, and back out they go. Note that there really was no danger there. In fact, everything about the spacing for that gives Amara control of the match. So her aim here, mostly, parry, stay, clip, make sure that everything's ready so that as soon as she can do it again, it actually works out somehow. Unfortunately, meter watching levels are a thing, and until you've got them, you won't always be ready for those sort of things. It does, however, matter where the ES Tatsu hits. I haven't mentioned that because I wasn't specifically saying that anyone else should use this in the Ibuki matchup. It takes quite a bit of practice. And again, integration into your style to know how and when to use it. So it's not really a thing you take and tell someone, oh, against Ibuki you should do this, without taking into account whether or not their style benefits from the space it preserves or makes it work because of the space they tend to be in. With all that said, there's nothing specific to take from this into the Guile matchup. It's one of the few times where I wouldn't say it's really possible to carry over from one bot to the other. Ibuki is approximately the maximum mobility you can get in the game, and Guile is more or less the opposite, at least when he's being played in the correct way that the bot is programmed to do. And so with that, we'll end the stream for the night, and hope you all have a good weekend, watch some of the interesting things around, and watch out for a Guile bot, which should be appearing once again within the next 2 to 3 days at 2-mk.org. Good night, everyone.